I'll talk for about an hour or so. If folks want to interrupt and have a question, please do so. Let me make that smaller. Just sort of chime in. And again, the topic of this morning and this afternoon's talk is the liberal arts revisited use of the humanities in medical and health education. I'm going to do something, knowing this audience, that's risky and maybe even a little bit foolish. I'm going to be talking to a whole bunch of humanities professors about the nature of the humanities from the perspective of a physician. So we'll see how that goes. In the Q&A, you can tell me how far afield I've went in my understanding of the humanities. But we'll sort of have fun with this and see what y'all think. Anyway, we'll go from there. So as you guys are probably starting to get used to, Emory is asking folks if we are inclined to do a land acknowledgement. I am talking from the university now, from the campus. So I'll read that. Emory is located on Muskogee Creek land. The university was founded in 1836 during a period of sustained oppression, land dispossession, and forced removals of the Muskogee Creek and the Cherokee peoples from Georgia in the southeast. The first Treaty of Indian Springs in 1821, signed by the U.S. government and the Muskogee Creek Nation. The Muskogee Creek were forced to relinquish this land, which is now part of DeKalb County and home of Oxford, as well as the Clifton Road campus. By all accounts, this was a coerced treaty. At the treaty signing, this the tract of land ceded became the part of Georgia. In 1822, parts of the land ceded in the 1821 treaty were incorporated as DeKalb County. This includes where Emory is currently located on the main campus. The 1821 treaty and others during this period led to a massive land dispossession from the indigenous nations and allowed for continued expansion of the southeastern plantation economy and the enslavement of Africans and their descendants. In terms of conflicts of interest and professional disclosures, I have none to report for this talk this morning. And then I throw in this slide to keep me out of jail, both literally and figuratively. Under fair use provisions, instructors at all levels who devote classroom time to teaching examples of published poetry may reproduce these poems fully or partially in their teaching materials and make them available to students using conventional educational technologies such as the PowerPoint and Zoom this morning, most appropriate for their instructional purposes. Everything that I'm going to show you in terms of art and poetry and literature are either in the public domain or being used in a way that's consistent with limitations of exclusive rights for the fair use provisions of the United States Code. So that's all a long-winded way of saying all of the art and poetry and other various things that I'm going to show and talk about this morning, I created none of those. These are all created by folks with far more talent than I. In terms of learning objectives for us this morning, the idea is that folks will be able to critically assess and appreciate, and I'm going to underline actually those two concepts, critical assessment and appreciation. We'll talk a fair bit about those over the course of the morning. But the folks should be able to critically assess and appreciate the use of the humanities in the practice and teaching of medicine, and to summarize humanities-based epistemologies and traditions, and explain how each of those informs medical practice and education. And hopefully you'll get a sense of what I mean by those objectives. In some ways, the next two slides actually summarize all of what I'm going to say, but said much more beautifully by two different poets. The first is from a poem called Asphodel, That Greeny Flower, by the physician, William Carlos Williams. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. And then from another early 20th century poet, Marianne Moore, in her famous poem Poetry, we are going to spend the next hour thinking about imaginary gardens with real toads in them. As in my introduction, you all know that I'm a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. I teach my residents about imaginary gardens and real toads and how to think about both of them simultaneously. So if for the next hour you think of nothing but imaginary gardens with real toads, I'd be really quite happy. So to ground us a little bit, to give a definition of what we're about to talk about in terms of medical and health humanities, and sort of just as an aside about that, One can think of this not just as medical humanities, but health humanities much more broadly. But anyway, the medical and health humanities use methods, concepts, and content from one or more of the humanities disciplines to investigate illness, pain, disability, suffering, healing, therapeutic relationships, and other aspects of medicine and healthcare practice. And that they employ these methods, concepts, and contents in teaching health professional students how to better understand and critically reflect on their professions and the intention of becoming more self-aware and humane practitioners. So that as a background, I think as a talk on the humanities, it's always good to start way back when, and often way back when is with Aristotle. And I think that will help us sort of understand by looking back at Aristotle, where we're going to go for the next hour and how we might think of the incorporation of the humanities in medical and health education. And in this case, to look at Aristotelian ethics. I am not an ethicist, and I'd be really interested in the folks in the audience that are, that can help me understand Aristotle maybe better than I do. But in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle thought of ways of knowing, or in his sort of phrase, forms of knowledge, that in his way, ethics was an understanding of a way of solving problems, and that there was different forms of knowledge to help us solve different problems. And in a somewhat hierarchical way, at the base, Aristotle posited something called techne, roughly equivalent to the idea of art or craft or technique, with the understanding of the form of knowledge of techne, which is how do you do something, to know how to do something. So techne would be really important if you're trying to build a bridge. You need to know how to build a bridge. Engineering, to a large extent, is techne. Lots of medicine is techne. Obviously, how to do something, how to do a particular surgery, how to do a particular procedure in medicine. This form of knowledge is vitally important. It's a knowing how to do something. But as we all know, that there are many ways of understanding problems and solving problems, and knowing how to do something doesn't get to all of those. So on top of techne, Aristotle posited epistemic, which he would think of, and we would think of nowadays, roughly equivalent to scientific knowledge. It's universal, it's context independent, and that's going to be important for us in a scientific way. Often, although I'll be broad in my thinking about science, is often context independent, which is going to be important. And it's a way of knowing why things happen. So in addition to an understanding of knowing how things happen from a technical perspective, it's also important to know why things happen. Again, this is roughly equivalent to a scientific understanding of things. But as you can imagine, even there, that doesn't get to all of the problems that are faced by humans, and certainly not all of the problems that are faced by healthcare practitioners. So on top of that, and again, Aristotle wasn't thinking of healthcare when he was writing this several thousand years ago, but it is helpful to us as practitioners to ground ourselves in that. So anyway, up on top of techne and episteme, Aristotle posited the concept of phronesis, which he thought of as practical wisdom. And sort of the definition of that would be a deliberation about values with respect to practice. And it was context dependent. It's how do you solve a problem that techne doesn't give you the answer to and episteme doesn't give you the answer to. It's the incorporation of a practical wisdom that's important, that's context dependent. And we'll get to that. And then as again, the philosophers in the audience know, he went above that, talking about Sophia and various other sorts of wisdom that will lead to even higher order thinking. But we'll sort of stop for our purposes at phronesis and try to understand the concept of a context-dependent practical wisdom that helps us when techne and episteme doesn't quite do it. And again, definition of praxis is the conscious willed action that through which theory or philosophy is transformed into practical activity. And for what I teach primarily, it's the practice of medicine. And to think through techne, episteme, and phronesis in the praxis of medicine. We'll jump ahead to do a little history of medicine, several thousand years, to the early 1900s. The physicians and maybe the historians of medicine in the audience will know about this. This was a report commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching in 1910. We know it conventionally now as the Flexner Report. It was commissioned again by the Carnegie Foundation to investigate American medical education and to see what was good about it, and even more so what was not so good about it. And this, for again, the physicians and health educators in the room, revolutionized medical education in the United States to an enormous degree. And it did several things. Again, it was in 1910, so about 110, 111 years ago. And it made a number of recommendations that to this day, every medical school in the United States absolutely adheres to 100%. And again, revolutionized American medical education in really profound ways. The first recommendation is that to tie medical schools and hospitals to academic or university centers. Up until 1910, many medical schools were freestanding proprietary institutions and were not connected to universities. That there needed to be an emphasis, importantly so, on scientific, empirical foundations of medicine and it be intellectually rigorous. That all of what was taught was rational or evidence-based. He didn't use evidence-based as a term. We would certainly use it for his report currently. That the nature of the work was based on laboratory work and was laboratory focused, again, connecting it with the rational and evidence basis for contemporary medicine. That the material was objective, as well as the systematic student assessment was objective and systematic. And then finally, in the report, he advocated for a greatly expanded pre-medical admissions requirement. Essentially, what the Flexner Report did was ground American medical education based somewhat on European medical education hard into the sciences. That medical education was going to be an empirically based, evidence-based, scientific, rigorous program. And from there on, medical education in the United States changed dramatically. He, however, did not stop at saying that we needed to change medical education to make it purely empirical and scientific. He advocated that education in the sciences, according to Flexner, was an instrumental minimum, and that's important. That alone was inadequate for medical practice. For dealing with more subtle elements, I would argue that was his understanding of phronesis. Flexner advocated a varied and enlarged cultural experience in order for the physician to apprehend his greatly modified ethical responsibility. So while the Flexner Report is almost always now thought of as to make medical education scientific, he was really quite clear that that was a minimum, that we needed much more in medical education for the education of the physician than simply the sciences. However, for those historians of medicine and those folks who are interested, the Flexner Report had many other consequences in addition to making medical education scientific and an advocacy for an enhanced cultural understanding of things. And I'll give you two really important examples from the Flexner Report that are only now in the last 20 or so years getting more scrutiny. And this is a line from his report, that this country needs fewer and better doctors. So thinking about the consequences of the Flexner Report in terms of two large groups, we'll start with women. At the time of the Flexner Report, there were 7 women's medical colleges. Shortly after the report came out and medical education was changed, 6 of those 7 closed. The only one that stayed open was the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. In 1900, roughly 5.5% of physicians were women. In 1915, that dramatically dropped to an all-time low of just around 3% of medical graduates were women. And the number of women physicians did not return to the 5.5% or so until the 1970s. So it took 60 years after the Flexner Report to just get back to those numbers. So it had a huge and really quite devastating effect on female physicians and female physician training. Even more so, it had a huge effect on African Americans. Similarly, there were 7 historically Black medical schools at the time of the Flexner Report. 5 of those closed. The only ones that were able to remain open were Howard and Meharry. And for the next 50 years, 75% of all Black physicians in the United States were graduates of those two medical schools. So let that sink in. So what the report did in its efforts to say we want to be scientifically rigorous, we want to have enhanced medical prerequisites, all of these things that I just described had, whether intentional or unintentional, and the historians can actually debate whether it was intentional on Flexner's part or not, it had a devastating effect on medical education in really profound sorts of ways. So we take that sort of as background in thinking about medical education, how it changed in the early 1900s, the advocacy for science and the advocacies for humanities in the education of physicians, but also the really negative consequences of the report. So the health humanities and the medical humanities and how they're used in medicine there are lots of different understandings of that. And I'll go through some, and I'll emphasize one or two particular areas for our talk this morning. You can think of the health humanities and the education of healthcare practitioners as either instrumental or intrinsic values. Do you do it for a specific reason, or do you do it to enhance some particular thing? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Or is it a more global way of educating a future healthcare provider? In terms of the specific utility of using the health humanities in medical and health education, we can think of a number of different ways that are all used, and I'll give you examples over the next little bit of how we might think of the health humanities and why we use them. So one example might be observational skills, that we're specifically looking for something. How do we teach future physicians or other healthcare practitioners to observe in different ways? And the humanities can really are extraordinary at that. We can use the health humanities or the humanities in general to rethink professionalism and ethics. These are obviously important concepts in healthcare. And how can we use the humanities to teach folks about that? How can we think about the humanities in terms of narrative? Narrative medicine and narrative health work is enormously important nowadays. And how can we think about the humanities in terms of narrative, and how might that help future physicians and healthcare practitioners? I'll spend a little bit more time thinking about humanistic epistemology, or the epistemology of the humanities. And this is where I'm worried that I'm going to get into a little trouble with you guys, and you guys can help me understand this maybe a little differently. But I'm going to try to talk about the epistemology of how the humanities understand the world, particularly in relation to a scientific understanding of their disciplines. And then further, we can think of the use of the humanities in the education of the medical student or other healthcare students in terms of equity and diversity, and also particularly in my field in psychiatry in terms of empathy. And I'll describe all of those to some degree, but spend a little bit more time on the humanities-based epistemology. So in terms of observational skills, I'll give you an example of this. This is a slide by Jan van Eyck of the Canon van der Pijl, and a famous painting for the art historians in the room or out there in Zoom land might be familiar with this painting. I throw it up there just as an exercise in observation. This is Canon van der Pijl. And for the physicians in the room, if there are folks often look at this painting and say, you can tell just by his eyes, and more closely his temporal region here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, that likely this gentleman suffered from temporal or giant cell arteritis. So as an example from a medical diagnostic perspective, let me go back to that, to use art to help our diagnostic skills and to help our observational skills. We don't know historically whether this fellow actually did suffer from temporal arteritis. Certainly the 500 or 600 years ago when this painting was painted, no one had an idea of what that was. Nonetheless, we might use art to help our observational skills. As I said before, we can think about the use of the humanities to help in terms of professionalism and ethics. And these are certainly things that future physicians and other healthcare providers certainly need to know, in large part because we don't always act as professional as we'd like to. This is de la Tour you can see in this painting, if you pay a little, sort of getting back to the observational skills, it's a fun painting. It looks like everyone in this painting is cheating. It's really quite amazing. So they're playing some card game and everyone is doing something not quite right, which I think is kind of fun. But anyway, one could think of the health humanities or using the humanities in general for the education of healthcare providers to think through professionalism. And what we mean by that, and this is a quote from J.J. Cohn, that the serious engagement with the humanities offers a unique and compelling way to tap into the emotional dimension of the clinical encounter and can validate for students what it means to be and not just act like a humanistic professional. And that further, that humanism provides the passion that animates authentic professionalism. So we in medical education spend a lot of time and a lot of effort thinking through how do we teach professionalism, because it obviously is so important for our discipline. And one particular way is to think through it in nature of the humanities and how can the humanities disciplines help us be better professionals. Moving forward a little bit, there's the idea of narrative health for I imagine many of you guys know some about that. It's using stories to help understand the nature of health and healthcare and illness and living and dying, and their narratives of healing, journey narratives, witnessing narratives, transformational narratives, all kinds of different narratives. The field in some way started by Rita Sharon up in Columbia in New York, and is very popular now in medical education. There are all sorts of writing workshops that help physicians write, and a long history of obviously physician authors. And I'll read a poem by one of ours here at Emory, John Stone, who many in the audience might remember. He was a pediatric cardiologist and the dean of admissions for the School of Medicine for many, many years. I feel indebted to Dr. Stone. He was either kind enough or foolish enough to let me in to Emory many, many years ago. And I think I still feel very, very kindly towards him. But this is a poem of his that I particularly like. And just as an example, and I'll give another one in a moment, of narrative medicine. This is called Death. It's death I have seen come on slowly as rust, sand, or suddenly when someone leaving a room finds the doorknob come loose in his hand. Or another example, this is a poem by Rafael Campo, who's an infectious disease doc up in Boston at Harvard, and it's called The Chart. And I think it's a particularly provocative poem for medical education, and I use it often with my medical students. And I'll read it for you. The chart says 54-year-old obese Hispanic female. I wonder if they mean the one with long black braids, Peruvian, who sells tamales at the farmer's market, tells me I'm too thin, I better eat. Or she is the Dominican with too much rouge and almond eyes at the dry cleaners, who must have been so beautiful in her youth. Or maybe she's the Cuban lady, drunk on grief, who I've seen half asleep, alone as if that bench were only hers. The park her home at last. Or else the Mexican who hoards the littered papers she collects and says they are her documents. If not, it could be that Colombian drug addict whose Spanish, even when she's high, is perfect. Or maybe it's the one who never says exactly where she's from, but who reminds me of my grandmother, poor but refined, lace handkerchief balled up in her plump hand, who died too young from a condition that some doctor knows in her chart overlooked. So that's some examples of narrative medicine. I guess for all of you, y'all are educators, but certainly in medical education, we know from our medical students that the value or the assessment of value in medical or health education is summarized by our students by 5 words. And those 5 words are, is it on the test? For medical students, if we say the answer is no, they pay little attention to it. If we say yes, they pay lots of attention to it. So our assessment, somewhat jokingly, is it on the test? And the answer for the health humanities and the medical humanities is increasingly yes, it actually is. The MCAT, the Medical College Admission Test, changed in 2015, its format, and incorporated actually a fair bit of humanities in there. There are sections from the humanities that are being tested that the students are asked to reason critically about, which is, I think, really quite wonderful. And even on the biological, social, and psychological foundations, the ideas of culture and social differences are really quite important. So the humanities are on the MCAT, which is the test to get into medical school. And increasingly, they are on the test on the USMLE, to the test to get out of medical school. It's the beginnings of the licensing exams for our students. And there is, to some degree, both on step 2 and step 3, questions and understandings about communication skills, delivering bad news, professionalism and ethics, interpretation of the social sciences, all of those things. I added to this slide the clinical skills on step 2 for either good or bad. You guys can, for the physicians in the room, you can opine about that. We no longer actually give the step 2 clinical skills exam. That went away this past year with the pandemic, and likely will not reemerge anytime soon. But anyway, the humanities are on the MCAT to get in and the USMLE to get out. I put this slide in to add a little bit of science to this. I'm going to talk a little bit about a paper that was in Science about 8 or 9 years ago. For the non-scientists in the room, if you get a paper in Science, you've arrived. That is a big deal. That is probably the premier scientific journal in all of the sciences. And this is a paper that was in there about 8 years ago, and it looked at at something called theory of mind. And theory of mind got its origin in the autism world, in psychiatry, and looking at folks with autism. And it's a concept which is, can you intuit, or at least sort of have decent guesses at what another person might be thinking and what their emotions and thoughts might be? It isn't a mind reading sort of game, but that you have some ability to say, based on the circumstances and the context and my conversation with this other person, how they're moving, how they're speaking, the tone of their voice, all of what goes into these sorts of things, can I have some guess as to what they're thinking and feeling? And you can further divide this into an affective, a feeling sort of theory of mind, then a cognitive or thought feeling of mind. Affective being the ability to detect and understand others' emotions, and cognitive, the inference and representations of others' beliefs and intentions. Again, as you can imagine, as I said, it got its origin in the autism world, and folks on the autism spectrum often struggle with theory of mind. They have a hard time understanding both affectively and cognitively what another person is thinking or feeling. But anyway, it's broadened much more broadly than that, to thinking of it more globally. And here was a little study done by Kidd and Castano that I think is really quite fascinating. It's unclear whether, from a science perspective, it's particularly meaningful because the ends were particularly small, but nonetheless, I liked it. And the study, in short, looked at, had the hypothesis that reading literary fiction can improve theory of mind, and there are all kinds of different scales about that. And again, the hypothesis was, if we gave a whole bunch of subjects literary fiction, we can actually improve their theory of mind. And so the folks were divided into 3 groups and then mixed and matched and all kinds of cool sorts of things to make sure that the data was reasonable. So that they were divided into 3 groups. A group that was asked to read nonfiction, and a group that was asked to read non-literary fiction or pulp fiction, and a group that was asked to read literary fiction, which, if I remember, was defined as fiction that won various literary awards. So you can probably quibble as to what those distinctions might be. But anyway, three large groups: fiction, nonfiction, literary fiction, and pulp sorts of fiction. And sure enough, the data seemed to support that folks who read literary fiction actually improved scores on theory of mind. And so the suggestion is the theory of mind may be influenced by engagement with significant works of art, maybe not just literature, but art or poetry or any other serious engagement with those sorts of disciplines, with the idea behind it, and I think it makes a lot of sense, that literary fiction asks you to think complexly about the characters in the story. That the motivations of the characters aren't simple. In pulp fiction, the murderer is a murderer because he or she is a murderer. He does bad things. in literary fiction, often the person is nuanced and much more complicated, and you're asked to think deeply. You're asked to immerse yourself in the idea of what is this person's thinking? What are they feeling? What's going on with these different characters? And doing so can actually dramatically affect theory of mind. Theory of mind, as you can imagine, is connected in ways to concepts such as empathy. And we certainly want our healthcare practitioners to have an enhanced theory of mind and to have empathy. And this gives us some scientific data to show that theory of mind it can be influenced by the engagement of the humanities and the arts, and is something that we would all, I think, agree that is good to have for the practicing healthcare provider. Connected with this, similarly to empathy, is the concept, a little bit vaguer, of emotional intelligence. Its emotional intelligence is sort of theory of mind turned inward to some degree. Rather than saying, I can sort of intuit what someone else is thinking and feeling, it's can I have an awareness of my own thoughts and feelings, and the ability to control and express those emotions to guide interpersonal relationships. So it's connected with theory of mind and empathy. And we have really good data that folks with higher emotional intelligence scores have been linked to better job satisfaction and work performances, unquestionably. We have the data exists in many different disciplines. I give a version of this talk to different disciplines. I gave this grand rounds recently to the Department of Surgery. And just as an aside, I've talked to the surgeons several times about this, of all of the professions in medicine that on the surface you would least think would be interested in this. It would be them. However, they're actually really quite fascinated by the use of humanities in their education of their trainees, which I think is really wonderful. But anyway, some data coming out of the surgical world, higher emotional intelligence scores in surgeons correlated with decreased burnout, which is a huge issue in medicine, certainly amongst medical and surgical residents. And so if there's a way of increasing emotional intelligence, that will potentially lead to decreased burnout, at least theoretically. Curiously, burnout there was no association between burnout and the milestones, which is a way we assess medical residents, APSITE, which is the surgical residency exams, or USMLE scores. So the only thing that actually did correlate with burnout had to do with emotional intelligence, which is certainly an interesting finding. So that is background about the nature of the humanities, how we might use them in different sorts of ways. I'm now going to spend a little bit more time going into what I think of as the scholarly traditions of the liberal arts. This is my way of reconnecting to my earlier education at Williams, something that I've never lost touch with and still love and think about often. So I will go through these, and again at the Q&A, I'd be really curious as to what you think. I'm going to speak broadly. I know that each of the humanities disciplines, and there are many of them, have different takes on these, but I'll paint a picture with a broad brush and be curious as to what you all think. So the scholarly traditions, and getting back to our learning objectives from right when we started, these are going to fall into two primary domains: critical assessment and appreciation. The first 4 or 5 are going to be in the critical assessment range, and the last 2 in the appreciative range. So the scholarly traditions are essentially, but not completely, interpretive, and in that they are concerned with meaning and value. That there's an insistence in the liberal arts and the humanities on context and contingency. They incorporate, to some degree, a hermeneutic of suspicion. Different disciplines are going to think about that somewhat differently, but it's an aspect of that. I'll talk more about what I mean by that. There is a connection in the humanities to history and to the past. That there is radical thinking about the field in terms of relational and relationality, in terms of subjectivity, and in terms of intersubjectivity. Those are all in the critical assessment domain. And then there is as well a spirit of appreciative inquiry and a spirit of epistemic humility. I'll talk about each of those in depth and why I think having an appreciation for all of these in the scholarly traditions of the humanities is extraordinarily, and I'll underline extraordinarily important for the developing physician or healthcare practitioner. Going to start with the interpretive. This is a famous painting by René Magritte, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, pardon my bad French. French was always the bane of my existences in high school and before. But anyway, you don't need to speak French to know that those words mean this is not a pipe in French. And what Magritte was getting at, and if we were live, we'd sort of talk about this more in depth, was to ask us to think really quite deeply about what it is we're looking at and what things are, and to try to understand it in complex ways. So one way of understanding Magritte's sort of his joke, if you can think of it that way, is to say, you know, what does he mean this is not a pipe? This is a pipe. And then you think a little bit more deeply about it and say, well, no, it isn't a pipe. It's a painting of a pipe. And then you can think of it even more deeply and to say, looking at the words, une pipe, a pipe, the noun une pipe and the words written on or painted on the canvas, both are not the thing itself, but a representation of the thing, of the thing, which is another representation of the thing, getting sort of further trains of representations. And then you can get back even further, ceci, the pronoun this, which is a representation of the noun, further gets us in a chain of representations. And that we use those chains of representations to understand and to interpret, leading to meaning and value. So the humanities disciplines appreciate a concept of meaning and value, and that there's a recognition and a negotiation of different perspectives and different experiences. This is, as you can imagine, quite important for these disciplines. I'll leave out the reference to deconstruction and Derrida for a different time, but in the humanities, we understand and appreciate differing subjectivities, and we have an appreciation in the humanities for multiple meanings of things and multiple functions. And we certainly, in my area of psychoanalysis, we spend a lot of time thinking about multiple meanings and multiple functions. So in essence, humanities disciplines, if not completely interpretive, very much understand the interpretive aspect of the nature of the work that is done, which is important. There is as well an insistence in the humanities on context and contingency. Getting back to Aristotle and the Nicomachean Ethics, if we remember, episteme was context independent. Science happens. It is and again, I'm speaking in broad brushes here to use the mixed metaphor, but science is to a large degree context independent. However, the humanities disciplines have a radical insistence on understanding something in its context and in contingencies. So we can think of this as science as general ways of thinking, and the humanities both think generally and specifically. So whenever we think in terms of the liberal arts, we're understanding what we're looking at or reading or consuming or whatever it is that we're working with or studying. It is understood in relation to its history, to its language, to its culture, to its ethnicity, or the folks that created it, or how it was created, or any number of different ways of thinking about that, as well as to the gender, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of religion, family of origin, time, ability, disability, all of those things. And we can probably add other ways of understanding as well. But the essence of this is, while the humanities disciplines and the scientific disciplines often and always think generally, they also, the humanities disciplines, make us think specifically. And we have to understand things in terms of its context, in terms of all of these things and many more. So that's an extraordinarily important aspect of humanities disciplines that to some degree differs from its scientific counterparts. There's as well a hermeneutic of suspicion for those folks that find those words off-putting, which I do as well. It's a term coined by Paul Ricoeur, who is a French philosopher, a while back, which is a way of a theory of interpretation with the idea of what we're seeing isn't exactly what we're getting, that there's always sort of, again, more to the story. And just as an aside, I kind of always find doing these talks fun because I add art that I think kind of pertains to whatever it is I'm talking about. For the art historians in the audience, this is Lucian Freud. This is Sigmund Freud's grandson, who was one of, if not maybe the premier portraitist of the 20th century, was really quite extraordinary as a painter. Again, was Sigmund's grandson, and his paintings now sell for tens and tens of millions of dollars, which is really quite extraordinary. This is a self-portrait with his two children, and the analyst in me has to point out what it might have been like to be one of these two kids, to have that as your father, and that the portrait was painted as that. So that'll give you some sense of what growing up in the Freud household might have been like. But anyway, there's at least a wrestling with the idea of a hermeneutic of suspicion, or hermeneutics in general. Again, there's always more to the story. You all remember from Dragnet years ago, it's just the facts, ma'am. The humanities, it was never just the facts. The facts are important, but how the facts are told, what the story is, how the story was told, who told the story, why the story was told in that particular way. It was in the humanities, it's never just the facts. There's always more to it. And for those folks who remember Dragnet, it was always a hysterical woman that I guess it was Joe Frada who would say it's just the facts, or maybe it was the other police officer. But anyway, in its old sexist sort of way. But the humanities, it's never that. It's an understanding that meaning is often hidden to both the object and the subject, and meaning is something that isn't necessarily simply on the surface, but always hidden, or there's always more to it than that. And that there's an inherent acknowledgement in the humanities disciplines, or at least there should be, of the inherent prejudices and the ability to know. And we'll talk about that again in a little bit as well. That as we're knowing something, as we're learning something, as we're studying something, as we're consuming something, we're aware of our inherent prejudices and how we understand things, how we know things, how we interpret things, how the meanings come about. That again, thinking very sort of generally about the sciences isn't necessarily there, although no doubt good scientists very much think that. And that uncertainty, skepticism, and doubt infuse the process of the humanities. There's as well a connection to the past in humanities disciplines. In some ways, it's again, thinking of it really quite broadly, the difference between the sciences and the humanities. To some degree, the humanities are recovery sorts of operations, although there's plenty of discovery in them as well. And the sciences is mostly discovery. And that the humanities are in constant dialogue with the past. So for example, again, thinking sort of generally, in the sciences, we might teach Newton in physics because it's a helpful way of beginning to understand physics. And it's a perfectly good explanatory system for a lot of things in physics, but it doesn't quite get to all of what's going on in physics. So more advanced physicists will enter an Einsteinian universe informed by Newton, but they're not studying Newton. They're studying much more sophisticated ways of thinking scientifically. So it's an idea of discovery. However, in the humanities, that isn't the case. It isn't that things aren't newly discovered, but that there's always a dialogue with the past. So it isn't as if Joyce, for example, is now a better way of understanding the literary universe than Shakespeare was. There's always a talk between the two and a dialogue between the two. So that we're looking at the past for insights as much as we're looking for the discovery of the new, or the new might be in the old. And sort of a handy way of thinking about this. It's to add as much as to replace. We're not, again, Joyce or Faulkner or Morrison didn't replace Shakespeare. It's adding to the way of our thinking. So there is a connection to history and the past. Things are relational. Things can be subjective or intersubjective, or at least we have an appreciation for that. As an example of that, for the English professors in the audience, we get the word truth from the word troth from Middle or Old English, which is a pledge or promise. We still have the word now troth in the term like betrothal, a marriage. So troth means pledge or promise. We now think of it, we get the word from that truth, which we often think of as synonymous with fact. We can probably have a whole very long conversation nowadays about politics and the nature and the differences between truth and fact. But for our purposes, the word, the etymology of the word truth comes from pledge or promise between two people. And not that it's a fact, but that it's an agreed upon idea, which is, I think, which is just sort of a fun example of thinking about things relationally. As I mentioned before, in thinking about things in terms of intersubjectivity, one cannot radically distinguish the observed from the observer, the self from the object. The observer influences the object, how it's seen, how it's created, how it's made, all of those sorts of things. This brings to ideas, and I'll move a little bit more quickly here, in terms of transference and countertransference in psychoanalysis. It also then brings us to the last two things in terms of appreciative inquiry, things like aesthetics. I remember from years ago, you take a class on art appreciation to actually think things about in terms of beauty, that there's a critical yet sympathetic assessment in the humanities that's important, and an appreciation for strengths and health, as well as weakness and illness. Mostly in medicine, we spend a lot of time talking about pathology, what's wrong, what's ill about someone, what's problematic, and comparatively less time thinking about what's beautiful, or in health, what's a strength, or what's healthy. In a sense, finally, in the humanities, of epistemic humility, which is a sense of what we know and what we don't know, and how we know things. That we need to be humble about that. This gets into a concept such as testimonial justice or injustice. I'll pass on that for a moment. And things like cultural humility. In medicine, we still teach something called cultural competence, or at least some places still do, where you have a lecture on what it means to be a particular, from someone from a particular culture, what they're about and how we understand them. And after that, we can make a checkbox to say, cool, now I understand this culture. The humanities tell us that that's, and rightly so, that that's complete nonsense, at least in my mind it is, and that we need to be humble in the face of difference and say, what can we learn and what do we not know about someone else? And I'll just, as an aside, my largest clinical mistakes in my work as a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst have been with people that look and act and talk just like me, and went to the same schools and went to the same religious organizations and did everything that I would say, oh, I know this person backwards and forwards. We grew up down the street from each other. I come from the same culture. And almost universally, when I think that, I mess up. I'm going to show you, hopefully, a little video of a class that I teach with my residents that gives you a sense of what I do that incorporates all of what I've talked about before. Hopefully this will work, and we'll see. Yeah. And then we'll keep going.
What makes for a great doctor? Well, some might say a good bedside manner. Others might say a brilliant mind is critically important. But in one class at Emory University School of Medicine, psychiatry residents are learning that art, literature, and music can help them become better physicians.
So this is a painting by Diego Velázquez, and he painted it in 1656.
A dip into art history is not a typical way to begin class for third-year psychiatry residents. These students have had 4 years of med school and are in the third of 4 more years of residency before they become full-fledged psychiatrists. Theirs is a world of science, of research, of symptoms and diagnoses.
The painting is a very large painting of a slice of life of the royal family. It's a painting ostensibly of the Infanta Margaret Teresa, who's at the time of the painting the only child of King Philip IV and Queen Mariana of Austria, who are the king and queen of Spain.
In psychiatrist Dr. Andrew Furman's humanities-based psychiatric case conference class, art, music, and literature are used to breed a better physician.
A lot of what we do in our education of future physicians is help them understand the pathology and the etiology of disease. But we don't do as good a job, I don't think, in teaching them how to relate to the person who has the disease.
I think there was some curiosity, like, oh, we're going to be reading poems and looking at art, and this is somehow going to make us doctors or something.
There is science to support using humanities to help teach physicians. One study shows that reading literature over nonfiction or pulp fiction can change something called theory of mind, which is a person's intuitive understanding of their own and other people's minds, mental states, beliefs, and thoughts. Basically, it helps us understand ourselves and others on a deeper level.
It did show some positive data to show that folks who read a literary story changed in their ability to then judge someone else. The hypothesis behind it, which is really cool, is that literary fiction makes you think complexly about people.
As does this iconic painting, whose subject appears to be the blonde princess.
Who or what do you think is the subject of the painting?
I would think it's the young girl in the center.
Until you realize everyone is looking outside the painting. That Diego Velázquez has even painted himself into it. And he's not painting the princess. It's a small detail that reveals the truth.
If you look at the painting, right in the center of it is a mirror. And you see two little figures in the mirror. And those two figures in the mirror are actually a reflection of the king and queen.
As the viewer, you realize where you're standing.
That we are in the same spot as the king and queen, which is really quite remarkable.
So how does this relate to being a better psychiatrist?
It's easy for physicians to say, this is pretty clear. You are the patient. You are the one with the illness. This painting says it's much more complicated than that. The nature of the relationship brings us together and that it decenters us. And it makes the future physician, hopefully, think more complexly about the nature of the relationship.
The students then listen to the song Strange Fruit, made famous when Billie Holiday sang it in 1939. It's a song that waxes poetic about scenes of the gallant South, but the title, Strange Fruit, refers to what's hanging from the poplar trees.
Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze.
You're talking about a man who's been murdered, and, you know, he's just strange fruit.
New York City school teacher Abel Meeropol wrote the song about the 1930 lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. The visceral contrast between the beauty and cruelty of the South speaks to the contrast within all of us.
Very ugly sides of human nature.
And how absolutely intertwined they are. Stories are enormously complicated, enormously so. And we need to wrestle with all of those complications. And this song says, look deeper, look deeper, look deeper. Literally, look at the roots of things. We need to continually do that.
As the semester draws to a close, the impact on future psychiatrists is evident.
The humanities play a role in your life.
I think that what this course has allowed us to do is explore stories in a way and listen for stories more than sort of through our routine training that we receive.
I feel like we can find a human story everywhere.
The arts don't just help make better physicians, they can make for a better, deeper human experience in a world where nothing is simple.
Going home and reading a poem, or going to an art museum and seeing an art, or seeing art, or going to a play and seeing that, or listening to music. If you really sort of try to involve yourself in it, it helps you look at the world in different more complex, more nuanced sorts of ways. And I come from a position where complexity and nuance is really important. I think making things simple doesn't often help things.
Life is moving faster than ever. With technology at our fingertips and often in front of our faces, it can sometimes feel like we're skimming over the surface of our lives at warp speed. Investing time and attention in a book or a piece of art or music is an investment that gives a return by helping us better connect with others and ourselves.
All right. So hopefully that gave you an example of a class that I teach with third-year psychiatry residents. I do a similar thing with my medical students. In the interest of time, I'm going to now go through some examples. There were some in the short video. I'm going to skip through the talking about Las Meninas, although there's a ton of fun things to think about. Here, I'll just quickly go through it. This is Picasso's version, and I spend a lot of time with the students going through the different versions of Picasso's version of Las Meninas and Velázquez's. And here's some paintings that have been influenced by that, by Velázquez and contemporary ones, and how you can understand that. And it's fun, particularly as a non-art historian, to sort of play around with those ideas. So I use this one. This is a Rembrandt, famous Rembrandt painting of the Anatomy Lesson of Nicholas Tulp. And here is a contemporary take on that by Kerry James Marshall, and what we can learn about where Rembrandt was coming from and where Marshall was coming from in really very important and provocative sorts of ways. And it allows you to have really fascinating conversations and hear those side by side. And then similarly, I'll do a little bit more art and then get to some poetry in just a moment. Here's Guernica, Picasso's famous painting of the bombing of the town of Guernica in the Spanish Civil War by the Germans, and the horrific aspects of that. And this is Faith Ringgold's painting from a series, Die. Curiously, Faith Ringgold went to the Met at the time. Guernica was not at MoMA, excuse me, was at MoMA for years during the 60s and 70s and as 50s and 60s, excuse me. She saw this. This painting now is at MoMA, painted 30 or so years after Picasso's, and I think from the terms of pride of place, hangs in the exact same spot where Guernica would have been. There was obviously renovations to MoMA. But it's really quite amazing, and to think about the nature of trauma in different communities and in different ways. So that's an interesting thing that I often use with my students. I'll read this poem. This is a poem by Louise Glock, who, for those folks that pay attention in the audience, she just won the Nobel Prize in literature back in October. And this is an early poem of hers that I use often with my students, that I'll read and talk a little bit about and then move on. The poem is called Gretel in Darkness. This is the world we wanted. All who would have seen us dead are dead. I hear the witch's cry break in the moonlight through a sheet of sugar. God rewards. Her tongue shrivels into gas. Now, far from women's arms, in memory of women, in our father's hut, we sleep, are never hungry. Why do I not forget? My father bars the door, bars harm from this house, and it is years. No one remembers, not even you, my brother. Summer afternoons, you look at me as though you meant to leave, as though it never happened. But I killed for you. I see armed firs, the spires of that gleaming kiln. Nights I turn to you to hold me, but you are not there. Am I alone? Spies hiss in the stillness, Hansel. We are there still, and it is real, real. That black forest and the fire in earnest, excuse me. So there's tons going on in this poem. It's obviously Where Are They Now from Hansel and Gretel. This is years after the killing of the witch and returning to Dad's house. And obviously a poem about trauma, and conventionally would think about it in terms of PTSD. And but it is so much more than that. It is a poem about the nature of relating, that they wished, that both Hansel and Gretel wished for nothing more than getting back to the safety of Dad's house, and they did eventually, and everything was fine, and they are now safe, and there is no physical harm, there is no any of that. They are fed and clothed and safe, and all is okay. Yet, obviously, for Gretel, it is not okay. Far from it. She still has these awful memories of the trauma, and is wrestling with the idea of why she has that and Hansel does not, and what safety means, and what being whole means, and what being healthy means, and what being secure means, and all of that. And there's many layers of that in this poem. There's even hints, or maybe even more than hints, of the different natures of how gender sort of factors into this, about the male way of understanding and the female way of understanding, and the nature of violence. And maybe in the Q&A we can talk much more deeply about it. It's a really incredible poem, I think, and I use it often with my psychiatry trainees to think through the nature of trauma and complexity. In the interest of time, let me just mention this is a poem that I often use at dusk by Natasha Trethewey, that I'm sure many of you know well, taught here for a long time. And I'm going to pass on this just again in the interest of time. I use a video and often lots of excerpts from Claudia Rankin's book, Citizen. And again, I'm sure many of you in the audience know her. We went to school together. We both at Williams. I cannot claim that I knew her at Williams, although we did overlap there. One of my regrets of my college education is not getting to know her then. But anyway, I use her work often with my students, and I'll go from there. And then, again, want to leave time for questions. I spend a lot of time teaching and using Wallace Stevens, which is really quite provocative for students. And then, again, I'll pass on the examples. Use this poem by Gwendolyn Brooks, A Song in the Front Yard, that is deceptively, either deceptively complicated or deceptively simple. The poem on its surface is really quite simple, the language is, but you keep reading it and there's more and more and more going on in there. And it is really quite both a beautiful and a provocative and compelling poem to get at the nature of identity and who's creating identity and what identity is about and whose identity and the meanings behind all of that. And really a good poem to—
A Song in the Front Yard.
And I'll go through it. Anyway, wanting to leave time for questions, I will leave the talk. We began with the land acknowledgement. I'll leave with a poem that I love just because it seems to sort of just speak to all kinds of different things for me, particularly the idea of home and family and relationships and all kinds of cool stuff. But anyway, it's called Perhaps the World Ends Here, and I'll read it for you and then leave it at that. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instruction on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table, we gossip, recall enemies, and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves, and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. This table has been a house in rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. And then here is, just to wrap up, a list of all of the artwork that I included in here and who painted it and where it is currently. So let me stop sharing and see if there are questions that you guys have. And sorry
Really?
I didn't get to more in detail about all of the poetry that I wanted to. But.
I really appreciate your contribution. Marilyn has her hand up, and then Lisa.
Okay.
Marilyn, unmute.
Yes, unmute, show yourself. A wonderful talk, and something that I've been interested in as a topic for years. I'm a medical educator. I'm a dermatologist and taught medical students and residents for many, many years, still am. And I also was very interested in narrative medicine when it was first getting started and did a lot of reading about it. And what surprised me was, and you mentioned plays only once, and that was in the video. And it strikes me as we look out there for ways to teach people, but people learn different ways from hearing, they learn from reading, that so much of narrative medicine is let's read novels, which takes a lot of time and for medical students. And I'm sure that they are interested in it, but fiction is somebody's idea of what's happening. And they also are giving you the background of what this person is thinking, which may or may not be so. But it struck me that no one really was using theater, was using plays to get, because so many in medicine are very good at grasping something from seeing it, seeing interactions and saying, oh, I get that. And that would be such a great way to teach, or to ask them to read a play, to read 2 parts and see what they get out of that. Has that been done much?
Yeah, yeah, not as much as I'd like, but I give you 2 examples of that we have done. One, a couple of years ago at the Alliance, they showed, they performed One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Yeah.
So I was able to bring my students there, and also in the Department of Psychiatry, we led a Q&A afterwards, which was really quite fun. So we spent a lot of time doing that. And also around that time, we were able to get Maggie Edson to come to the medical school and talk, and I felt really quite honored. We read part of Wit there. It was really quite scary to me to be able to do that in front of Maggie. But yeah, so we do it, but not as much as we would have liked.
I read Wit for Women's History Month, and Maggie was there, and I prevailed upon the medical school to see if students wanted to be some of the parts in it, and they came, and I think got something out of it. I went back to school after I retired and did all the coursework for a master's in theater and directing, and so I think it could be so valuable, and it just you just need that connection with theater people. I think it would be a good thing. Anyway, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And the art, absolutely the art, yes, because we use that in dermatology. We show medical students the question is always, what's going on here? Why do you say that?
Yeah.
And it's you leave them alone, 4 people alone with a painting for 15 minutes, and they really have to start coming up with something. So anyway, wonderful, loved hearing it. Loved your talk. Thanks.
Okay, Lisa.
Yes, thank you. That was splendid. And I wrote down many things. I teach a course on literature and science, and I was wondering if you had any short fiction or novel suggestions that I could teach in that.
Let me think about that, and I can get
Okay.
I can get back with folks. Yeah.
Okay, I did think of Trethewey's poem about Dr. Samuel Adolphus Cartwright.
Oh yeah.
Thrall, that I thought that might be an interesting suggestion too. Poetry is really a lovely idea to teach in a course like that. I need to do more of it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
Denise.
Hi. I too am a medical educator, OBGYN, perinatology. And I found your whole discussion quite interesting. I had so many things I could ask you about, but I'm going to start with, for the most part, humanities are perceived from a white gaze. Go back in history, we're all talking about white people. And in fact, the stories of anyone who isn't white are kind of left out.
Mhm.
I think it's very interesting that a lot of your art was from Black artists.
Mhm.
But for the most part, those stories are excluded. And that impacts, if you're trying to teach about it, how you bring it into a space that is overwhelmingly white and has a very white perspective. So even when you talk about concepts of professionalism, they're all based in behaviors that tell us we have to act like white people. And we get graded on that in terms of our behavior. So I went to undergraduate school in the late 60s, and I went to medical school in the 80s. How do you, I would also say that while you may be doing this, I don't see that there's a general push in medical education across residencies, particularly those in non-academic centers. In OBGYN, that's where the majority of residents are trained. So how does one think about changing, in general, medical practice through this? And then also, you're doing this now, but all those people who trained with me and afterwards, they're going to be out there doing medical practice for the 40 years afterwards.
Right. Yeah, you ask a really, really important, or several important questions, of which I don't have a great answer to. I wish that I did. What I sort of think about is sort of answering, or trying to answer some of your questions in different sorts of orders, what I try to do with my students is to not necessarily have them have the answer to any of this, but to make sure they're asking more complex questions about things. And that the more I'm able to do that to more people, that they will start hopefully doing that with more people. I've tried and continue to try to get this to be a more established part of the absolute medical curriculum. And the response I get is, wow, this is wonderful. We love it. This is great. What do you want to not teach so that you can teach this? And I just put up my hands and go, I could actually give you a list of things, but you're not, that isn't going to be helpful. So there is a real resistance to teaching any of this in medical schools. But my feeling is, nonetheless, I'm going to try and teach every audience that I can potentially teach, and see what happens. The more we do, the better.
Okay, Carrie, I think is next.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Furman, for a really important and very interesting talk. Thank you. Thinking in terms of the theory of mind and this relationship between the just what the implications of looking into these deep prospects are. You think of the great artists who were also medically connected. You mentioned earlier John Stone, a great illustration of this. Alexander Borodin, William Carlos Williams, I believe, was one, and also, if I'm not mistaken, Anton Chekhov, also related here. But this relationship between the real literary fiction and the more sort of popular fiction contrast brings to mind an interview with John Grisham, and he was there with Eudora Welty, and the interviewer asked him what direction does this movement in Southern literature take at this point? He said, "You're asking me? I'm standing here with Eudora Welty."
Right.
So it really strikes me as just a real important contrast in terms of what you're achieving here and developing, this aspect in professional people such as you are very important. And thank you again for this wonderful talk.
My pleasure. Let me add another physician poet that we normally don't think of as a physician, was John Keats.
John Keats.
Yeah, so he was trained as a physician, gave that up early on for poetry, and seemed to do okay for himself.
Yes, yes.
Okay, Gretchen?
I think what I want to ask you is about your experience in your undergraduate years at Williams, again, majoring in religion and what was it, great books or
history of ideas, yeah.
Right, and you must have done the pre-med work, right,
yeah.
to get into Emory as you did. But I'm wondering at what point it occurred to you that some sort of fusion of the humanities ways of knowing and being with the scientific would make sense and really should become part of medical school education. I mean, when you got to Emory, I guess, as you said, John Stone was already here, wonderful John. And I think of a book like Laney's book, Education of the Heart. This was Emory's medical education at that point sort of infused with?
No, not particularly.
Right?
No. Yeah.
And I assume that was probably so in most places in the country. How did it happen for you that you realized that this would be an important direction for medical education?
Yeah, I think it was both sort of professional and personal, in that as I was going through school, I was trying to I went from a small liberal arts college doing very much humanities-based things to being in a large lecture hall learning science, which I thought was interesting, but to be honest, was not nearly as fun. And then as I started as school went on and I started to think about what it is I wanted to do professionally in medicine, it became clear that I wanted to incorporate both. I wanted to do the science, but not to lose the human part of things that I was doing. And it became clear to me that psychiatry and then later psychoanalysis allowed me to think in both ways. And of all the professions in medicine that maybe it's easiest to do that, it's in psychiatry. So I was able to do that, and to some degree following in the footsteps of Freud in certain ways, in that he also very much wrestled with the relationship for psychoanalysis between that as a cultural and social and psychological discipline and a scientific one, and that he very much tried to balance the two. You can make arguments as to in either direction as to how successful he was. But just as an anecdote about Freud, he won the Goethe Prize from Germany for literature, and was quite disappointed that he never won the Nobel Prize in literature, not in science, not in medicine. So he very much was involved in the humanities as well as the sciences. Now, I'm not comparing myself to Freud for a whole host of reasons, but there's a long tradition of that in my field of folks who are interested in both. And it's not just in psychiatry; it's a lot of as the person just before said, in medicine, there are lots and lots of folks that are very much interested in this.
Well, and Freud, among others, so wonderful at telling stories, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Very effectively.
Yeah.
But in your case, you didn't just incorporate that into your practice. You decided to turn to teaching to really emphasize it. And I mean, did you have any trouble persuading Emory to let you go big time with this approach?
What I tell folks is I just started doing it and without asking permission, and eventually folks said, "Oh, that's cool. We'll keep doing it." So it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Have you been able to do any team teaching with people in the humanities?
Not yet, but I'm very much open for that. Would love.
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
Gretchen, I can give you an example that we've done. Sandra Gilman, who very much was part of the interdisciplinary studies, and I taught a human health and nursing class on the science and culture of sleep. And it was just fascinating.
Wow.
Have both perspectives. And our undergrad nursing students were reading some from Alice in Wonderland, some from Freud, and they really enjoyed the variation from reading research articles. And I had a lot of fun teaching it. And we even had one on music and sleep. There are people around that are doing little bits. And I think there's definitely a push to bring the humanities and healing arts together. I know we have a faculty that was hired through, I forget which foundation, and she's a historian of psychiatry on the nursing school faculty.
Yeah, I'm blocking on her name. It's the Mellon Foundation who does.
Yeah, it's the Mellon, yes.
Yeah.
And she's from Australia and has added a great deal of depth for our students at all levels. So it's a beginning, it's little,